welcome everyone to the Novo Nordisk Network for Healthy Populations virtual seminar today. And we are so pleased with the speaker that has agreed to speak today, as well as the topic. But before we begin, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. And my name is, by the way, Lorraine Lipscomb, and I am the director of the Network for Healthy Populations at the University of Toronto. So first of all, we would like to acknowledge that the land on which the region of Peel operates is part of the treaty lands and the territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, and we are coming to you today from the Peel region, where the network is housed. For thousands of years, Indigenous peoples inhabited and cared for this land. And in particular, we want to acknowledge the territory of the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Ojibwe-Chippewa peoples, the land that is home to the Métis, and most recently, the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, who are direct descendants of the Mississaugas of the Credit. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land, and by doing so, give our respect to its first inhabitants. We are all treaty people, and many of us have come here as settlers, immigrants, and newcomers in this generation or generations past. And we would like to also acknowledge those of us who came here forcibly, particularly as a result of the transatlantic slave trade, and pay tribute to the ancestors of African origin and descent. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for attending today's Network for Healthy Populations seminar entitled Equity Research in Canada, an Overview and Some Thoughts About Ways Forward, presented by Dr. Arjumand Siddiqi. Before I introduce to Dr. Siddiqi, I'd like to quickly review some housekeeping items. Number one, we appreciate our audience muting themselves during today's presentation. There will be an opportunity for questions at the end of today's session, and we will be inviting questions both through the chat box as well as using the raise hand function. If you have questions during the event that you would like Dr. Siddiqi to address at the end of today's section, you can always enter them in the chat box. And lastly, please note that today's session is being recorded, and we will make the recording available on the network's website. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker for today, and I'll ask Dr. Siddiqi if she wants to turn on her camera and she can start sharing her slides while I introduce her. Dr. Arjumand Siddiqi is a professor and division head of epidemiology at the Dalla School of Public Health, and she also holds a Canada Research Chair in Population Health Equity, all at the University of Toronto. She holds appointments as well at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and the Gillings School of Global Public Health at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Dr. Siddiqi's research focuses on how policies and other societal conditions explain health equities, and in particularly how they arise, why they persist, and what might change them. She's also working on philosophical implications of work in this area. Dr. Siddiqi received her doctorate from Harvard University. And so we're so thrilled that Dr. Siddiqi has agreed to present and speak to us today on this really important topic. So now I'm going to pass it on to Dr. Siddiqi. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lipscomb. Thanks for the invitation. It's really nice to be here with everyone, and Dr. Shah for the initial invitation as well. So I thought I would do sort of an overview of what I perceive to be some major issues in doing work in this area, and more importantly, sort of some major assumptions that we make and some major approaches, and just sort of try to peel back the onion a little bit. So I came across this graphic that the Blue Cross Blue Shield of Minnesota put together. And it sort of tries to demonstrate how risk factors for diabetes are distributed. So they say, 40% is socioeconomic, 10% is your environment, the physical environment, 30% is your health behaviors, and 20% is healthcare. And part of the message of a graphic like this is that there are a lot of modifiable risk factors, and that, in fact, socioeconomic factors, social determinants of health, are arguably the most important of all the determinants. And while I laud the sort of impetus to demonstrate how important context is for understanding health, I submit that actually this is probably a better representation of how determinants of diabetes are organized. And that is to say that you can't really parse out the social from the biological, from the healthcare, and so on. And that these things actually operate in a pathway going from the social, generally speaking, through to mechanisms through which the social operates, which then results in health outcomes like diabetes and outcomes related to diabetes. And for those of you in and around Canada, you may know that the Canadian Medical Association has a similar graphic. Again, I think this was sort of to highlight how important the social is. And they say, well, your life is 50% of you, your healthcare is 25%. I'm not sure how that's not your life. 15% is biology. Again, I'm not sure how that's not your life. And 10% your environment. And again, I submit to you that in general terms, instead, what is actually happening is that these risk factors interact with each other. They are sort of organized in a mechanistic way that moves from the social to the behavioral and biological through to health outcomes. And this is a framework that the World Health Organization Commission on Social Determinants of Health put together. And I could put up variations of this that people have kind of picked at and rearranged in various ways. But the basic message holds, which is that on the left-hand side, there are aspects of societies like their social policies, like various environmental factors and so on, which either produce social groups, income groups, racial groups, gender groups, and act on those groups to then create differences in how those groups experience behaviors, stress, living conditions, healthcare access, and so on. And that is what ultimately affects health. And so if you think about that framework, one striking thing about it is that even though it's called a framework on social determinants of health, it's really a framework on all determinants of health. And so in many ways, when we talk about health equity and we talk about social determinants of health, we are effectively talking about population health. So imagine that we need to explain how populations become healthy or sick or what have you. Well, this is the range of determinants that organizes population health. And essentially the message is that population health is fundamentally organized across social groups. So we may think about behaviors that affect population health, or gene environment interactions, or healthcare access that affects population health. Ultimately, those are caused, those mechanisms are caused, they are distributed across social groups, and that's not by accident. That is ultimately by design of policy and what have you. So when we talk about health equity, we are essentially talking about population health and vice versa. If you talk about population health, you can't but talk about health equity. And so I think that's one major shift that we need to undergo in how we understand public health and population health. Even if you're not interested in social determinants or you don't work on health equity, it's not your field, there has to be an acknowledgement that that is implicated in every downstream mechanism and determinant we have. So let's talk a little bit more about this issue of social determinants and sort of why they are why determinants are arranged the way they are, why social determinants are sort of the root causes. So you can see from this graphic that social determinants like socioeconomic position, social class, ethnicity, race, gender, etc., and the policies that kind of organize them on the left-hand side The reason they are on the left-hand side is because they fundamentally shape the downstream factors. And so we think of them as the root causes of the mechanisms that produce ill health. And that's really significant because what it means is that social determinants affect multiple outcomes through multiple mechanisms. So social determinants affect diabetes, they affect depression, they affect asthma, they affect cardiovascular disease, they affect almost every outcome of which we know. And so they do that because they affect almost every mechanism of which we know. They affect all the biggies, our diet, our living conditions, our exercise, our stress, our ability to access healthcare, which is effectively what is implicated for almost all health outcomes. So what it means is that if we intervene on one mechanism, which, as someone in public health, I can sort of safely say tends to be what we do in public health. We tend to focus on people's behaviors. What it means is that intervening on that mechanism still leaves open many mechanisms through which social determinants will affect health. And this is a graph of a study that was done to look at income differences in mortality. And the basic idea here is that as you go lower in income, the odds of mortality rises, not surprisingly. And then they said, well, what's the contribution of a bunch of really important health behaviors, smoking and alcohol, and they use body mass to proxy for diet and exercise. And we can argue about whether the measures are good enough or not. But if we take for a moment that they're decent, if you adjust out whether people in different income groups had different health behaviors and therefore had different mortality rates, in the gray bars, you can see that actually those behaviors made very little difference to mortality. So the main cause of differences in mortality across income groups in this study and in many like it is not that different income groups had different health behaviors. And that's a somewhat shocking kind of insight when we operate on the assumption that health behaviors are our main point of intervention. Why? What else could be causing differences in mortality? Well, this is a study that looked at income differences in allostatic load, a physiological measure of stress that incorporates cortisol release, it incorporates blood pressure, and so on. And what it shows is that over the life course on the x-axis, you see consistent and, in fact, growing differences in allostatic load between poorer and richer people, whereby poorer people experience more stress early on, and that accumulates throughout the life course. So not a behavioral risk factor, but a physiological stress risk factor for differences in mortality. So another reason it really matters that social determinants are kind of root causes is that often when we think that we're going to do good by intervening on mechanisms, we get swamped out by these big social forces that are happening. So imagine that you're intervening on behaviors, but there's big things happening on the left in society that the behavioral intervention just cannot compensate for. This is from a very old study of a major health promotion intervention that was done in Finland, in North Karelia, where they noticed very high levels of cardiovascular disease. And the study sort of shows that even in regions where they did not intervene on behavior, so they did not have a population health promotion intervention, you saw declines in cardiovascular disease. And so the idea is, yes, you intervened in North Karelia. Yes, it looks like it worked. But in fact, if you look at other regions, they had that decline as well. And so it calls into question whether the health promotion efforts actually were what caused the secular decline in this case, in mortality. And this paper sort of says, rather than exporting these tired and failed health promotion models, shouldn't we do something else? Shouldn't we think about policies that actually might account for why all of these regions had a secular decline? This is a graphic from Toronto Public Health. And Toronto Public Health in 2005 set out to measure socioeconomic inequalities in a range of outcomes. And then they saw that there were significant inequalities across income groups in Toronto. And they said, well, we're going to implement some programming to address this. And they did. And 10 years later, Toronto Public Health went back to measure how inequalities had changed in the city. And in fact, they had gotten worse. Why had they gotten worse? Not because Toronto Public Health did a terrible job in the health interventions it tried to implement that were within its capacity, but because this was a time during which median income declined, employment became more precarious, housing became more unaffordable, and so on and so forth. So if you're Toronto Public Health and you implement a health education program at the same time that people's daily circumstances are so dire, it's just impossible for that health education intervention to swamp out what are large societal forces. So the other kind of thing that I notice in public health that we often think is, okay, we're in public health or medicine. We can't change social policy. And so what can we do? Well, we can implement often behavioral interventions and education campaigns and what have you. And what often happens is that we kind of miss why these inequalities are happening in the first place, because we assume they're happening because people behave differently, and that the root cause of social inequalities is differences in behavior. This is a study where they tried to track differences in hospital admissions for a diabetes-related outcome, hypoglycemia. And they essentially said, what we want to know is whether people in different income groups are admitted at different rates at different times during a month. And so their hypothesis was that if you are high income, it's probably pretty consistent during the month, whether or not you're admitted. It's kind of, random. But that if you are low income, you would expect that admissions for hospital for hypoglycemia will rise during the course of a month. Why? Because people run out of money. So low income people are more likely to get admitted for hypoglycemia later in the month because they start to run out of money, and that affects their diet, and it probably affects their stress. So it's not that they don't know any better. It's not that they need to be educated about how to eat. And God knows they don't need to be educated about financial literacy. Please don't take that away. We have evidence about the fact that they actually manage their money better than most of us do. But they have so little money to deal with that as the month progresses, the trade-offs they have to make are really dire and cause difficulties in blood sugar regulation. So I think what I'm trying to say to you in many ways, in addition to the fact that social determinants are root causes, is that the reason they matter is a material reason. It's not a social, it's not a sort of primarily a behavioral reason. It's not primarily even a cultural difference. Most of it has to do with the material circumstances of life. And I want to talk a little bit about race ethnicity and why we find race ethnic differences in health outcomes, including diabetes, and how we misunderstand or misrepresent that oftentimes. So this is a study from Canada. It's just one of many examples I could have put up, which tries to investigate type 2 diabetes in First Nations populations in Canada. And it has been very common to try to find the genetic reason that Indigenous people have higher rates of diabetes. And often you'll see language like this that kind of hedges their bets. Like, oh, it's not genes, but it's gene environment interactions. But the implication is that both are different in Indigenous people than in the general population. And this is just an example of what Indigenous as a group comes from. This is a socio-political designation. So it's a collective name for the original people of North America. And, if you're interested, I read a fascinating article in the New Yorker some time ago that questioned what Indigenous means in the global sense and talked about what criteria are used and the fact that it's inconsistent. In any case, it's a socio-political designation that refers to more than 630 First Nation communities, over 50 Indigenous languages, and so on. And I think it's Fatima, who is a medical anthropologist. And in anthropology, for a long time, they've studied very carefully how genes and languages track each other in cases of geographic isolation, and how they kind of become more continuous when you have exchange with other populations. So, we are attributing genetic hypotheses to groups that are social and political, and it doesn't make any sense. And we keep doing it. And I'm not sure how to shake us of that. But if you had a population geneticist as your speaker, they would be horrified that we still do this. But we do. This is from a study where they looked at a single Indigenous group, the Pima Indians, who live both in Arizona and in Mexico, because at some point in history, a political border bisected their community. So this is a single Indigenous group. For all intents and purposes, you can think of it as relatively genetically homogeneous because they haven't had a lot of mixing. And they wanted to know why it was that diabetes was so strong and so prevalent in Arizona amongst Pima Indians. And they said, well, let's see what's happening to the Pimas in Mexico. And here's what they found. Pimas in Mexico had 1/5 the type 2 diabetes rates of Pima Indians in the US, in Arizona. And it's so very difficult to attribute diabetes to genes when you see data like this. Here's a non-diabetes example. This is a study from Illinois that was in JAMA many years ago. They looked at 3 groups of moms: Black moms who had been born in Africa and immigrated to the US, Black moms who had been born in the US and so were likely African descendants of slaves in the US, and white moms who were born in the US, also likely with a long colonial history in the US. And if you look at the birth weight distributions of these 3 groups, the 2 most overlapping groups are the African-born moms and the US-born white moms. And the riskier, lower, shifted left distribution is that of US-born Black moms. Socially, we would categorize African-born Black moms and US-born Black moms as Black. But in fact, those are not the groups that are most similar, because birth weight, like diabetes, is not genetic and race is not genetic. So what you're seeing is that the argument collapses, both because the fundamental groups are not genetic and because these outcomes are not very genetic, particularly when you talk about why social groups are different. So another way to show you how this kind of plays out on the left is a graphic that the Genome Project put together, Human Genome Project put together to try to explain to us what's happening with genetics and human populations. Do they differ across geography? Sure. but they don't differ in ways that map onto what we socially call race and ethnicity. So the blue circle, the giant blue circle, is sort of African genetic totality, if you will. And you will see that European and Asian genetics is subsumed within that genetic group, because of course, all people come from Africa. And so, we're thinking about this wrong. These are not distinct genetic groups. On the right, another way to show you this is a sort of graphic of genetic distance between various population groups. And you can see that there are population groups that would be considered Black, West African and East African, for example, that have more genetic distance between them than do East Africans and many Mediterranean people. So we have to kind of figure out a way once and for all to disabuse ourselves of this idea that race or ethnicity is genetic. This is a graphic of a study where they looked at genetic distinctions within South Asian countries. And again, South Asian is not a genetic group. I don't kind of know how to say it without being exasperated, because we do it so much, but I think we're just going to have to come to terms with this. Similarly, if you look even at very insular societies that don't change, they don't have much in-migration, much out-migration. This is Japan. Their outcomes change over time. So this is birth weight, and birth weight in Japan has declined significantly over time, even though the population hasn't changed. So again, race, ethnic, indigenous differences are not genetic. It's not even that they're kind of genetic, but also other things. No. So, genes may drive outcomes in part, though at the population level, usually not much, but they don't drive social group differences. And these are absolutely social groups. Here's an example where, again, we just sort of can't let go of this rhetoric. This is racial differences in COVID-19 cases in Toronto. And you can see that most non-white groups had a much higher share of COVID in the gray bars than their percent population in the green bars. Reverse is true amongst whites. And again, we couldn't let it go. This eminent physician says, I wonder how much of the disease is socioeconomic and how much is genetic. No, not at all. And so what we see from many studies is, this is one by Rao and colleagues, and they show that there are differences in COVID outcomes depending on the proportion of essential service workers in the community. And so greater number of essential service workers was associated with a greater proportion of COVID cases, and you can kind of see why that would make sense. So on the right-hand side, you have COVID as an outcome. The main way to get COVID is to be exposed to it in the air. When does that happen? Well, it generally happened when people had to go to work. They were essential service workers. Everything else, whether it's contact from families, et cetera, from neighborhood institutions, all of that sort of collapses back to the initial contact, which tended to be from essential service workers. Why were there more Black and brown people doing essential service work? Because of racism in the labor market, in the education market, and so on. And so again, you can see that the exposure to the SARS-CoV-2 virus is intimately and mechanistically related to social and societal determinants. And that's what a general graphic like this is telling you. So let me say a few more words. One is about the fact that we're very used to talking about determinants. And I know I'm often guilty of that as well. And in some ways it makes sense because it helps us identify the factors that are operating. But I think it's more useful to think about the larger story, if you will, that's operating, so that we don't feel like these determinants are somehow truly isolated factors that we can kind of intervene on. This is a study from the journal Circulation, and they, not a very social journal, I should add. And they essentially said, I think we need to come to terms with what's really happening with racial disparities in a bunch of cardiovascular outcomes. And they created this graphic. And if you start at the bottom, they talk about poor cardiovascular and stroke outcomes. And you'll notice, again, to the point that population health and health equity are effectively the same thing. They don't talk about poor outcomes in Black people. That's you see that when you go up in the framework. But in any case, they talk about poor cardiovascular and stroke outcomes, and they basically say this happens because of a bunch of risk factors associated with cardiovascular disease and stroke, things like diet, et cetera, and toxic stress. And they say, well, that happens because there are a bunch of sort of institutional characteristics of society that produce those vulnerabilities in stress and in risk factors: healthcare access, housing conditions, school funding, access to capital, meaning access to wealth. And then they say that is a function of a set of institutional features of society that are both contemporary and go back historically. And so they talk about the fact that you see racial biases in all kinds of arenas, in the justice system, in Jim Crow laws pre-1965, segregation of housing through redlining, and so on. And they say that this is ultimately related to the basic foundation of US society, and I might add Canadian society, which is that it was organized in a way to create concentration of power and resources amongst white colonialists. And so they produced, and the legacy continues, they produced institutions that allow maintenance of control of resources and power. And that has effects down to your individual biology. It has negative effects for Black and brown people and more positive effects for white people. And that's why you see disparities. So it's very difficult to disentangle one of these determinants from the fuller picture. And that's frustrating. It's difficult, but it is absolutely the case. The example I gave you earlier with Pima Indians, to understand why diabetes is so different in Mexico and Arizona, we have to understand the fuller historical, socio-political context that leads to differences in the risk factors that Pima Indians are experiencing in Arizona versus Mexico. Similarly, there's a large discourse on the increase in particularly white mortality, now Black mortality as well, in the US and in several of our peer countries. For us, our life expectancy is stagnating, so we're marginally better off, but not much. This is kind of hitting us as well. And two very eminent economists, including one Nobel laureate, have been talking about the causes of this rising mortality. And for two economists, they don't do a lot of regressions. They have written very lengthy stories about what they think is happening, about the decline in manufacturing in sort of the 70s and before that, and how that decline and the decline of unionization essentially changed the prospects of white Americans who used to be able to have a high school education and still live a pretty middle-class, decent life and afford a home and afford to send their kids to school, et cetera, et cetera. And now that's not possible. And so that is difficult to get down to a bite size. You get much more information when you understand the fuller context of what's happening. Let me just conclude by giving you a few examples of why I think all of this is really important to digest. So I'm going to take you back to the Toronto Public Health graphic, which again demonstrated that for 21 of 34 health indicators, that Torontonians were worse off. Health inequalities were worse in Toronto than when Toronto Public Health tried to address them. And again, why? Because there was a bunch of social and economic conditions that just completely swamped out anything that a local public health unit could do. And I want to submit to you that this is an issue that shows us not only do we have health inequities, not only do social determinants matter, but despite some decades of trying to address them, things are getting worse. Things are getting worse. I mean, we're not in 1990 where people were saying, pay attention to social determinants. I think we're long past that. I think people incorporate consideration of social determinants routinely, but things are getting worse. And I think that's something that should weigh heavy on us. If you want sort of broader population stats on this, on the left are US data, on the right are Canadian data that we produced. And if you look at changes in life expectancy over time, you can see that the largest gains are going to the highest income groups, those top lines, and that the lowest income groups are either declining or stagnating. And so the disparity is actually widening over time. That's not good. That's not good. And I think we really need to have sort of a moment to sit with our strategies and the fact that the larger evidence is suggesting we really need to have a rethink. And I'll leave it there.
Dr. Siddiqi, thank you so much for really outstanding overview and presentation, and really thought-provoking. I'm going to open it up to questions, and feel free. Okay, we've got Blake Poland. Thank you so much. Fantastic talk, Arjumand. Yes, I agree. Does anyone have any questions for Dr. Siddiqi? Either, go ahead, Beju. You can take your camera off if you want.
Hey, Arjumand, thank you so much. That was really thought-provoking and insightful. What I wanted to ask you is, you ended off with that sort of depressing note that things that, as we've been paying more and more attention for the last 20, 30 years, things are getting worse. So I wanted to get your thoughts as to A, why that is, and B, what do we need to be doing differently to change that? And particularly, as health researchers and clinicians, like what do we do to do things differently?
Yeah, it's nice to see you, by the way, Beju. It's a great set of questions. My best take on why things are getting worse is that social and economic conditions are getting worse for the worst off. So I think low-income people have less security. Things are more expensive. Governments have cut back on benefits tremendously since the mid-90s or so. And we have lost all sight of it. So I'll give you an example that comes from one of my former students who's just brilliant about all of this stuff, Faraz Vahid Shahidi, who's now at Institute for Work and Health. He, I don't know if you guys will remember, but there was for a little while pre-Ford, there was talk about a basic income pilot in Ontario. And the idea was that, stop with this making people apply for benefits and all of this stuff, and just pick an income threshold under which everyone automatically qualifies for benefits. And it would be much more generous. The amount would be much more generous than what they get now on social assistance. And he pointed out to me that if you adjust for inflation, the proposed amount for the basic income pilot was still much lower than what people used to get before welfare was cut back in the mid-90s. Like, what do you say to that? What do you say to that? So in some ways, it shouldn't surprise us that things have gotten worse, despite the fact that we're trying to pay attention to it, because the major policies, the major institutions that affect people's lives have gotten worse. And I think we're just so used to it, right? So many of us grew up in an era where you only had those policies. And so we don't even have, unless you are not in medicine and are reading, other things, because you guys have other stuff to read. But unless you kind of have that historical perspective on social policy, this seems normal. Mm-hmm. So I think that's one thing. The second question about what can you do as clinicians is infinitely harder. And take this with a grain of salt, because I'm not a clinician. And so there may be things that I'm not thinking of. So in my mind, one of the best things you can do is to say we can't do much, and to throw your political weight behind the sectors of of society that can. Mm-hmm. It's to admit that this is a problem that is not medical or even for the public health system to solve. Right. I mean, that's tough, right? Like, that's a tough thing to say to you. But I honestly think if we keep doing this, we're going to keep seeing interventions that may succeed on some micro level, but ultimately you're going to see the widening. And so I think we need to have, as they would say in the South, a come to Jesus moment about this. Mm-hmm. Like, it's not to say that the interventions are useless, but it is to say that if we're interested in population dynamics, we need to understand that those interventions will have almost no effect.
Right. But I mean, so not even as a clinician, but even as a health policy researcher or a health, a public health researcher.
Yeah.
It's the same answer, I guess. But
I think it is. Yeah, I think it is the same answer. I mean, I think one maybe useful way to think about this, though, is to say, maybe what we should do is that when we are focused on a particular set of determinants that are maybe more downstream, that we do something to engage the upstream in our narrative. Mm-hmm. And so I am actually not of the view that your study is completely biased if you don't address upstream factors. But it is a narrow snapshot of what's happening. So there's bias, of course, if, there's confounding, et cetera, but that's not really what the issue is when we take out social context. It's not biasing the question we're asking. It's that the question we're asking is fairly narrow and doesn't give us a good sense of what's actually happening.
Mm-hmm. And I imagine there's a limit of your reach and sustainable impact, right? When you're just, what do they say, moving the chairs around on the Titanic, right?
That's exactly it. That's exactly it. I think what we've been doing is moving the chairs around on the Titanic. Mm-hmm. And now we see that with this data that shows inequalities growing and so on.
So Blake Polland had a question in the chat asking if could we name neoliberal globalization for why things are getting worse for the worse.
Yes. Yeah, we can. I was going for a more general audience answer, Blake, but yes, sure. Like, this is about neoliberalism, and neoliberalism really was about this idea that individuality and markets and your market power should dictate your life circumstances. And so that meant pulling back on government intervention, or I should say it meant pulling back on government intervention that supported people who are more disadvantaged and vulnerable. There's plenty of government intervention that helps richer people. But effectively, neoliberalism, it's a way to sort of, it's like a philosophical basis for how to arrange policy. It's an ideology, it's an economic kind of ethos. It's all those things, and it swamps everything around us. And so, you could even argue that when we focus on a single policy, we're sometimes missing the boat, because it's not just about income assistance. It's about income assistance in the context of lack of secure jobs, lack of unionization, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, no, it's very, very important to sort of have that framing. Any other questions from the audience? And while people are thinking, maybe I can ask one, Arjumand. So I was really interested in, you touched on the fact that the social, like the direct effect of social conditions leading to intermediary sort of changes, and then how that directly affects biology in your example of the allostatic load. So I thought that was really interesting. Now, I've also sort of read some things around the role of critical life windows and early exposure from a social perspective, right? So adverse social conditions that are affecting people in early life that have longevity, even if we intervene later, those sort of factors have led to sort of persistent changes biologically in people. And I wonder if that is contributing to what we're seeing for certain populations who have these adverse metabolic and cardiovascular sort of outcomes going right into adulthood, even if their social conditions have changed. So that it's important for intervention.
Yes. It's an excellent point, and I think that's absolutely true. So these adverse childhood experiences, ACEs as they call them, and a lot of sort of literature on sort of early exposures, even in utero, to stressors and other things that do have some sort of long lasting changes. We think that that's kind of mediated epigenetically. So that there's epigenetic changes that happen early in the life course that then travel with you. What I don't know is whether I subscribe to the idea that that the evidence is strong enough that it's really that locked in, or whether the strength of the intervention downstream is just not enough to compensate. Right. So we tend to say things like, it's kind of like there's a path dependency established early in life, so we should intervene early in life. And we say that because we try some very circumscribed intervention later, some behavioral intervention later, and show that actually it didn't overcome what happened early in life. But I don't know if that would be true if you really significantly change people's life circumstances down the road.
Right.
And actually, that's another maybe helpful thing to say in this audience. So sometimes we evaluate our interventions, and we kind of figure out some evaluation technique that maybe says if you had the intervention or you didn't, was there a difference? And I think we're a little hard on ourselves sometimes, because you're not taking into account the context in which that intervention unfolded. So if you have two groups that have pretty tough lives, then okay, maybe there's you're looking for a marginal difference, but it's a lot to put on an intervention to change these kinds of outcomes when people have such tough lives.
Yeah, but I do wonder, there's also that, possibility that you're also helping the next generation. So maybe we're looking, I mean, not to say that we don't, there may not be benefits of maybe social policy changes for the current generation.
Yeah.
But you're also then, hopefully we can bend the curve.
Possibly.
And narrow those inequities as for the generations come. I mean, so that could be one silver lining.
Totally. I think so. Yeah, I think that's very fair, especially if you did something that was strengthening and stress relieving for the whole family, so that it carries through with the not just the child, but the family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's a question from Huda Shah. Go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Siddiqui. I just wanted to thank you again for your talk. It's always wonderful to hear you speak on these things. I just wanted to thank you for mentioning the genetic component, because I think that, there is an overemphasis on, the genetic aspect of the diseases. And I do find, as a South Asian researcher myself, I grew up thinking that South Asians were just more prone to diabetes and we just have bad genes and we're just weaker as a people. And, you don't take into context, okay, like these people have gone through the trauma of colonialism. There's a lot of trauma of migration to different countries, et cetera. And now that researchers are starting to highlight these things, I think it's finally coming to light that although there might be some kind of epigenetic changes that occur, we're not putting money towards trying to understand how to reverse some of those epigenetic changes. I think that the overemphasis is still in trying to understand what those epigenetic changes are or how biologically people differ. So I just wanted to get, I guess this is more of just like a commentary, but I just wanted to get your take on how do you feel about funding being allocated so much towards finding out these genetic differences, where there's not enough funding in terms of, finding out if therapy options to improve family relationships for these groups that go through colonization, et cetera, might help to reverse some of these changes, et cetera. I'm just throwing that out there. But yeah, how do you feel about the allocation of funding and allocation of research resources, like us not even understanding what can help to reverse some of those quote unquote biological changes?
Yeah, thanks so much. It's a great question. I had a colleague who said he just marvels every time the head of a major health institute is appointed and they're a geneticist, because it's often the least important of all the determinants. And it's really a signifier that we still continue to do that. And so I fully agree with you in terms of the sort of funding and emphasis of research being heavily genetic and heavily, not social. It's amazing that there's kind of a race ethnicity renaissance right now, because I got back to Canada in 2010, and for 7-8 years I would apply to CIHR and get summarily rejected because talking about race is racist. And I have a friend who lost his CRC because he does work on race, and he's one of the most sort of eminent social epidemiologists, eminent epidemiologists in the world. And they decided that we shouldn't talk about race in Canada. And even policy-wise, I mean, to Blake's earlier point about, can we talk about the fact that this is neoliberalism, to give you some sense of the disconnect between medicine and public health and the world. I have submitted grants to CIHR that have proposed to look at things like, let's say, income inequality and health. And I get reviewer comments that say, this researcher has clearly published a lot in this area in good journals and done a lot of work, but I haven't really seen that they've been able to change policy with their work. Like this is like a decades-long global entrenchment of powerful forces driving policy. Why would you think, as a researcher, I would change that? It doesn't make any sense. But the paradigm is based on these small interventions that are, you're supposed to say, oh, I changed things in this community by implementing this intervention. To the earlier point, like at least just to know what the social forces are, you might not be able to change them. And you probably won't be able to in one study. I can almost guarantee you that. But to not want to know and to have some ethos that we have to show change every time we ask a question, it's asinine. And it just it's like a total disconnect from how the world actually operates.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Have you seen any success stories where people have, like, where really upstream policies have actually managed to have some impact on health outcomes?
Yeah, yes, but in the opposite direction. So part of the problem is that over the last many decades, I always say this, when I study how social policy affects health, I'm mostly studying how bad policies make health decline, because that's what we've been doing. That's kind of what the neoliberal era has been about. It's to make things worse. But I will say this. So part of the story, and part of why it's frustrating to hear, clinical scientists ask you if you've changed income assistance, is because a lot of times change happens not through planned evidence sharing, but just capturing some policy or opportunity window that emerges. So one of my first mentor was Canadian. It was Clyde Hertzman, who did early child development work. Wonderful guy who died far too early. He was the kind of guy that was constantly in touch with different people in different sectors of life. And when some opportunity came up that he thought he could infuse knowledge and suggestions about child development into into whatever was happening, he would do it. He couldn't have planned for it. He couldn't have sat down and had a meeting and said, here's the evidence, now go change your policy. But he made sure that he was connected and listening and engaging enough that he'd seize the moment when he could. And so, we were on the World Health Organization Commission for Social Determinants of Health. We wrote a very nice glossy report with lots of evidence in it. I don't know if that went anywhere, but we had lunch in the cafeteria of the WHO headquarters in Geneva. We happened to be sitting with a lawyer who works on the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and Clyde managed to change how countries report on early child development because he had a conversation in the cafeteria with that guy.
Wow. Well, that's actually really inspiring, just to know that, that's, it just takes those being at the right place, the right time. But I always say, luck comes to those who are prepared, right? So we also need to
absolutely.
Yeah. So, we're almost out of time with just 2 minutes left. There've been a couple of points in the chat. One was just saying, once echoing what everybody's saying, very interesting discussion. I find your point about social political groups versus genetic racial groups really good. Of course, what we're talking about. And then Ghazal Fazli, one of our wonderful young faculty, thanked you for your talk and provided you. She reminded us of a paper. Maybe do you want to speak about it, Ghazal, in the last 30 seconds?
Sure. I just wanted to thank you, Dr. Siddiqi. I always love listening to you. You're always so inspiring. And I love the way you package the story for us all the time. Just wanted to point out, your zip code determines your health more than your genetic code. It really resonates. And we all know this, but an inspiring piece to think about the work that we're all doing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's great. Thanks for that reference.
Thank you so much, Dr. Siddiqi. I'm sure we could continue to talk, but we are just about out of time. So please, everyone, join me in thanking Dr. Siddiqi for an inspiring, thought-provoking, and important talk. Very important for the work that we are embarking upon, and we're really pleased that you could join us. So please complete today's evaluation for the session. We put a link in the chat, and we'll also send it directly by email. And just to remind you that our next network event is on October 16th, 2023, and that is our periodic network for healthy populations, BBDC, joint clinical and population research and progress rounds, again, October 16th at noon. And we are delighted to have two of our young faculty speaking, Dr. Aza Isa and Dr. Mavra Ahmed. So without further ado, we hope to see you there. And thank you once again, everyone, for joining. Bye-bye.